Absolutely. All right, listen, just in case, I'm still collecting homework if anyone has it. I would be glad to receive it. I just want to see if we're good at listening and if we're picking up on things that people are saying and not saying, as the case may be. And as I announce that, just know that this is one of the last sessions we'll be together. Next Sunday is our last time together as far as apologetics. And then it'll go back to Ish. He'll be doing his thing. And he'll walk Sunday school class. But this is next to last apologetics. So for today, we're going to be talking about atheism, and then we're going to go back to theism, and we're going to expand theism, because we just mentioned it 3 weeks ago when we started theistic apologetics. And so those two bookends are what we're going to get to today. Next week, we're going to get to what we call Christian apologetics, which is a little different than what we have done. We've got non-theistic apologetics, which is where we started, and then we went to theistic apologetics, and then all of these are in theistic apologetics. And then we'll get to Christian apologetics. We're going to talk about supernaturalism, and then we're going to give you some questions. A lot of the questions we have actually been answering on Sunday mornings. But those are considered Christian apologetics. What do you do with people who ask questions, who are legitimately born again, but might not be convinced of the truth? And so that's where Christian apologetics comes in. And we're going to talk next Sunday about that. Make sense? And we'll wrap all of this up next Sunday. Are we having fun yet?
I don't believe it.
Well, and if we're not,
That's a lot.
and if we're not done, we're going to call it done. That's all we get. All right? So listen, let's jump right into atheism. No, let's do a little bit of review. Let's catch you guys and just see if it's been sinking in a little bit, okay? Just a little bit of review. Again, we won't get to these just yet, but let's start back at non-theistic apologetics. And we talked about pathways to knowledge, right? And that's what all of these are. There are people who believe that this is a certain pathway to knowledge. This is how we know what is true. And so at first we talked about agnosticism. Someone tell me what agnosticism is. Quick definition. Welcome back, Mike.
How you doing?
Good. Yes.
They believe something about there, but they don't know what.
Okay, so that is a weak agnostic. We don't know that God exists. What is a strong agnostic? We can't know that God exists. What do you ask to a strong agnostic?
If you can't know that, there's got to be something else that you can do.
That's right. See, the fact that you said that God is unknowable is the first thing that we know about God. Exactly right. So if we can know one thing about God, that He's unknowable, are there other things that we can know as well? Then you take them, if they say, well, possibly, and if they say possibly, you've now turned them into a weak agnostic. And to a weak agnostic, you would ask what?
Would you be willing to look at some evidence?
Exactly right. Would you be willing to look at more evidences that there is a God? And then you walk through that with them. Excellent. So I've got these all written down in the order that we looked at them. Rationalism. What is a rationalist? Or rationalism? What's the idea behind it?
Really reason.
Yes. If it's logical, it must be true. Right? What's a question we can ask someone who is a rationalist?
Do you know anything that...
Oh, that's a good one. What's
that's
that?
not true now? Something that's changed its status over the years.
That's right, and you can ask him that. This was very practical. Do you believe in Santa Claus? Right? And again, it's a great question that leads them into more and more questions. All right, so what is fideism?
Just faith alone.
Faith alone is the pathway to knowledge. Exactly right. What would you ask a fideist?
Can faith prove anything?
That's exactly right. Great question. Because the idea is faith can actually prove anything. And then you begin to go down that path and say, well, faith can prove this, faith can prove that. So is faith enough? Next we looked at experientialism. What is experientialism? You can use part of the word in your definition. Experience is the pathway to knowledge, exactly right. What would you ask an experientialist?
If your experience is different than my experience, who's right?
Exactly right. How can we know what is right if my experience is different than yours? Good question. An evidentialist. What is evidentialism? What?
They need proof.
They do need proof, but they will say, though, that evidence is the proof for truth. What would you ask an evidentialist?
Would you be willing to look at some other evidence?
Absolutely. If you're going to base it on evidence, now, again, we look at the laws of probability into an evidentialist. That's tough. We don't need to get into all that. We did that. Pragmatism. What is pragmatism?
If it works, yeah. If it
Yep.
works, it's good.
That's right.
It's true.
Whatever works must be true. What would you ask a pragmatist?
Oh, well, is that working for you now?
Oh, well, is that working for you? Yeah. Well, what if what works for you doesn't work for me? And then you go down that path, and there's lots of other questions we can ask. Then we started into these. These are now theistic apologetics. And let's go with deism. What is deism? Deism. We're going to see how Austin and Down did. This is the one that they presented.
They said it did a lot better than you did.
I know, they told me.
Definitely short.
God
This
exists
way?
out,
No,
That's
time-wise.
what I thought.
God exists outside the world, but he doesn't intervene.
That's right. See, God is outside of everything that he created. They'll admit that there is a God and that he very well could have created, but he doesn't intervene in the world. So what's one question you could ask a deist?
Why create something if you don't want to have anything to do with it?
Yeah, why would God create something and then absolutely have nothing to do with it? That's almost counterintuitive. Then we talk about pantheism. What is pantheism? Yeah, God is all and all is God. God is everything. Exactly right. What would you ask a pantheist?
If, like, am I talking to you or am I talking to God?
Great question. If God is all and all is God, then how do I know who's talking? Are you talking or is God talking? Great question. Right? Again, it puts a pebble in their shoe. Then we talked about panentheism. What is panentheism? It's a little different. This is pan means all. Theos is God. This is all is in God and God is in all. Okay? So it's not that God is all. God is just in it. He's not it itself. Right? Make sense? So what is one question you could ask a panentheist? Exactly right. So if God is in everything and everything's in God, like this would show, then how do we know what is right and wrong? What's the difference between good and evil? And is there? Great question. So today we're talking about atheism. All right? Atheism, by definition, just means in Greek is a prefix that means no or non. Theos, God. There is no God. Okay? Now, atheism rejects every idea of God, little g. No such thing as any God. So you can be a Buddhist and believe in your version of God. You can be a Hindu, believe in your version of God. You can be a Christian, believe in our version of God. An atheist says no such thing as any God. Make sense? You with me there? All right, so they reject anything that is supernatural, which means an atheist believes in what is natural or naturalism. Everything is based on nature and nature alone. These guys are the tree huggers, as well as these guys, but for different reasons. These guys are tree huggers because they believe God is the tree. These guys are tree huggers because nature is the highest entity of everything. And so you have to honor it. It's all nature alone. Make sense? You with me? They deny the miraculous. They deny divine revelation, any kind of divine purpose, and the life hereafter, or immortality. No such thing. These guys are very close to these because they will also believe in some kind of cycle of life. And it's very easy for them to get into reincarnation. So I'm not going to get into reincarnation like I did a couple of weeks ago, but just to state that it's very easy for these guys to lapse into that. Are you with me there? Okay. We're not going to get to the roots of atheism because it doesn't matter. Because all these guys, who cares who they are? David Hume, anybody know him? Yeah, I don't either. Immanuel Kant. Actually, Thomas Jefferson is a big atheist. Voltaire. Okay, let's get to the response to atheism. Because that's where we need to earn our money. When we talk about the response to atheism, these are things that we can start thinking. Again, this is all mind work. Okay, this is part of the preparation of the mind. If we want to respond to an atheist, these are some of the things that we have to encounter. Most of these things are things that an atheist will say or things that they will think. Okay, so like the first one. Oh, sorry, these are the fill in the blanks. This is A underneath 3. Either 1, things need a cause, or 2, things do not need a cause. All right, now listen, this is an argument that you need to start thinking. If someone says, I'm an atheist, you start thinking, wait a minute, do things need a cause or do things not need a cause? If you think that, let's fill in the blanks first. If, 1, things do need a cause, well then who caused God? These are questions that you follow up with an atheist, okay? Because an atheist will struggle to believe anything about any God, especially a God that is uncaused. Yeah.
Define cause.
What's that?
Define cause.
I will in just a little bit, but let me give you the brief definition.
Yeah.
Right? Everything that has, and they call it contingent being. There's necessary beings, then there's contingent beings. Everything that is contingent needs a cause, or a reason to be, or a cause to be. You and I were created. We were caused to be. God, because by definition needs to be beyond human, is uncaused. God has always been.
So thus it can't be.
That's their thinking. Exactly right. Does that make sense? That's why there is no God. Because
So who caused us?
that's the thing, okay? They'll go back and they will say things like, well, have you ever heard of the Big Bang Theory? It was all of these things floating around, bang, everything happened, and here we are. Now that makes sense to them, okay? Because they don't believe in necessary beings. They believe in everything being contingent. Contingent on what? Well, could have just been an accident.
I believe in cynicism. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, listen, it takes far more faith to believe in this than it does in Jesus.
Amen.
Okay? It really does. Which is why Eric Metaxas wrote a book, Is Atheism Dead? And the reality is, in today's society, you're going to have a hard time finding a strict and disciplined atheist. Because it just doesn't make sense. Especially since science is proving again and again and again to line up with the Scripture. The more that we have, like, I forget the name of that scope that goes beyond the Hubble telescope. Does anybody remember the name of that? Gene would remember it. But whatever the name of that is, again, it goes 10 times farther than the Hubble telescope. And again, it confirms everything that the Bible has recorded as true. And so with that, we go, oh, look at that. It's hard to find a real atheist. But you might come across one. Now, where was I? Either things need a cause or they don't need a cause. If things do not need a cause, then where did all this come from? Exactly what John said. And they struggle with that. And then it's like, well, the Big Bang. And then you can say, so is there enough evidence to prove that that happened? And there's not. Does that make sense? You with me there? So they would try to find causes that are absolutely impersonal and accidental. So if we can start thinking, if you're talking to an atheist, I need to talk to them about causes. So either everything needs a cause or everything doesn't need a cause. Either way, we've got it. Does that make sense? Because if they say, one, everything does need a cause, well then we can ask, well then who caused God? And they go, If they don't need a cause, well then how do we get this? Make sense? You with me there? All right, number two then. Either good is, one, based on God's will, or two, not based on God's will. Now they're going to struggle with both of those because if they don't believe that there is such a thing as God, here's where we get then, how do you define what is good? Right? If there's not an altogether good one, then how do you define what is good? So we can start thinking, well, what's good based on? Is it based on God's will or is it not based on God's will? Obviously, they will say it's not based on God's will because there's no such thing as a God. We'll get to that one. That's number two. But first, if good is based on God's will, then keep in mind, they'll say, well, that good is arbitrary. It really doesn't matter. Because there is no such thing as God, so good can't be based on God and His will. But if good is based not on, or is not based on God's will, well then any God that they will give credence to is less than the ultimate being. Now we'll talk about this later. I have to state it now, and it's going to sound confusing. But when we get to the questions, you'll understand why we're asking the questions based on these truths. Make sense? Sorry, I'm not going to give them all to you now, but it's just important for us to know that. Because to an atheist, keep in mind, one, you need to think about, is there such a thing as a cause? The second thing when you think about it, if I'm talking to an atheist, what's their definition of what is good? And where does good come from? Make sense? Yes? Two things we need to keep in mind? Okay. C then, here's a question. Have you ever been asked this? Can God create an unliftable stone? Now, how would you answer that?
For us, yes. For him, no.
Yeah, why yes for us and no for him?
Because we have limitations and he has none.
God says he can do all things.
Yeah. So can God create a stone so heavy that he could not lift it?
Well, can he do something that's logically impossible?
We're going to get to that because
Square
that's
triangle or something like that.
exactly, and we're right. So well, we're going to do a bunch of questions, but that's the point. So when we're thinking to an atheist, right? Obviously, God can only do what is logically doable. You and I have to understand that when we're talking to an atheist. God can only do what is logically doable. Now, oh man. All right, I'm just going to rattle these off. If you want to jot down these scriptures, there's scriptures that prove that God can only do what is logically doable. He cannot do what is contrary to his nature. Keep in mind, when we started this whole spiel on apologetics, we understood that by definition, Apologetics is a thoughtful and logical defense of our faith. What we believe better makes sense, and it does. So if God is God, right, and he cannot do anything that is logically undue, or he can only do what is logical, then anything that contradicts his nature can't be done. Let me give you some examples, and we'll give you verses. God cannot look on sin with favor. Can't do it. Why is that? Because he's holy. So God cannot look on sin with favor. That's Habakkuk 1:13. Can God deny himself? No. God will not or cannot deny himself. Why is that? Because he is uncaused, necessary being. 2 Timothy 2:13. Can God lie?
No.
Why not?
He is the truth.
He is the way, the truth. Exactly right. So if God is truth, he cannot lie. Titus 1:2. Can God tempt anyone or be tempted to sin?
No.
Why not?
He's perfect in every way.
Okay? James 1:13 says it, so if you want the reference, there it is. God is illogical for someone who is holy to be tempted to be unholy, or to tempt anyone to be unholy. Why is that? That contradicts his nature. God, if we think about who he is, if he is ultimate uncaused being, it would absolutely be absurd for us, or self-contradictory for him. I mean, think about this. We know that the book of John, right, chapter 1 says that chapter 4, God is spirit. So is God a material being? No. I mean, we humanize God, don't we? We call him he, him, but is God really a he and him?
No.
No. But God, theos, is in the masculine form. But spirit, John 4, that says God is spirit, is in the neuter. Which means not male, not female. God's nature is spirit. He's immaterial. And we fumble all over that, don't we? Now listen, please understand. Everywhere in God's Word, God is never used in the feminine form. Theos is in the masculine form. To say God is Father makes sense. To say Son in the masculine makes sense. God is female, illogical.
But I don't understand, because Jesus came down in the body, so, but you're saying that God is not material.
No,
So he,
God is spirit.
yeah, God is a spirit, but I don't understand, because he was Jesus in the flesh, yeah.
Right. But see, he took on flesh. Why did he take on flesh?
To be like us.
Kinsman.
And do what?
To show us the way.
To do what to show us the way?
He's showing us how he can come into this world and live perfect, or like a life without sin.
And because he's perfect and without sin, what did he do?
He was sacrificing.
That's
He became an atonement.
That's right. He was the perfect atoning sacrifice, right? He became sin on our behalf. Right? 2 Corinthians 5 says, he who knew no sin became sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God. So he was the perfect atoning sacrifice. Having said that, it would have been easy for God. He could have flipped the switch in heaven and done that, but he didn't. He took on flesh. Sorry, Kevin, what you said.
No, God's not referred to in the feminine, but there are feminine aspects of it. When it says, I want like a mother hen, I want you chicks to come under my wings.
Exactly right.
You know, that aspect. You know, who would forget their nursing babe? You know, I will not forget it.
Exactly right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Male and female.
Yeah.
But he's also it,
Yeah.
because he's referred to as the lily of the valley. What? He's a flower now? No, he's not any of those things. He's likened to those things so that we can understand who he is.
Because of our minds.
Exactly right. Does that make sense? So God, by his very nature, is immaterial. He's spirit. Well, he became flesh when he sent his son. Why is that? Because he needed to make perfect atonement for our sin. Does that make sense, you with me? Okay. Where was I? God cannot do what is contrary to his nature. Where am I? Under C. Well, let me just bring this up here too. What's that, honey? Okay. Because Dom asked a good question. Can God create a square circle?
No.
And we go, well, he's God, he can do anything.
Logically, it doesn't make sense.
Right? God has to be logical, and he is. Why would God even want to create a square circle?
Isn't it an octagon?
What's that?
Isn't that an octagon?
Yeah. But a circle doesn't have any corners. An octagon has 8, right? At least meetings. But you get the idea. Now, that's a challenge for us. But the challenge is actually more for an atheist. Okay? And that's why they don't want to consider any of this stuff. It's just easier for them to say, yeah, there really is no such thing as a God. Yeah.
You know, this whole thing on logic, you know, our logic gets in the way of this. Because God is logical, but it's, when he does things that are logical, it's only because of his logic. Like becoming sinful, to me, that's not logical. Why would I sacrifice myself for I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
God?
Yeah.
Because it met his logic, not mine.
And we're going to talk a little bit about that in the service today, because when we talk about God's love compared to any other love, can we really fathom that? A love that sent his only son to a cross. What? I mean, listen, my firstborn son, which, by the way, I just saw his picture in that little yearbook over there, a little blonde-haired nugget. I'm like, would I really offer him as a sacrifice for anyone else? Well, I would struggle with that.
For your worst enemy.
Yeah, because, right? And then when you look at Romans 5:8, right? And while we were yet sinners, we're going to talk about that this morning. Really? Would you send your newborn son, an innocent little, precious little blonde-haired towhead, would you offer your son or your daughter even for someone who's living against you, opposes you outwardly? See, that's a love that for us, that doesn't make sense. But that's God. And in his logic, it makes perfect sense. Are you with me there? Okay, so, are we still under C? Yeah. Well, let me just put this in. I read this is the fancy term for what Dom said in creating a square circle. A logical impossibility is contrary to God's nature as logical. And it goes back to what Kevin said. Because we have to understand that logical to God is different than logical to us.
His ways are far above.
Far above. But here's the wonder of this. God gives us enough to know that what we can believe in him is absolutely logical. So that our logic, and that's where, guys, I want you guys to understand, when you place your faith in Jesus, it makes sense. And even our minds can understand that that's what I need to do. Can I understand the fullness of God's love? I might not be able to understand the fullness of his love, but I understand it enough that he did it for me. And that makes sense. Why would I not receive his love? Why would I not ask him to forgive me of my sin? Because that's what he sent his son to do. I don't get it fully, but I can receive it. Make sense?
Can you repeat the logically impossible?
Oh, a
I bet you
logic.
can write that down now.
Yeah. Try to remember.
A logical impossibility is contrary to God's nature as logical. And that's the square circle.
Okay, so all this
Or
reminds
the
me of,
unliftable stuff.
we can't understand God's love, sending his firstborn son. And as I'm sitting here listening and thinking, it's like, okay, it's kind of like, he did that for us and we don't get it. But yet we can look at Abraham and Isaac. Abraham was going to do exactly that. And so he trusted God the Father enough to not understand it, but to go and do it. And I think that's where we are, this side of the cross. We can dig in the Word, we can see the examples, we can pray, we've got the Spirit within us and work within us. And then we can step in and move towards that logic that God has. We don't have the same logic, but we can start moving in that direction.
Because if we take what Cindy is saying to its natural nth degree, we end up as a fideism. Well, that's only by faith. All right, listen, faith is involved, but it also is a faith that makes sense. It makes sense that God would offer his only son, because only his son could be perfect and sinless, right? I don't want someone's sacrifice that was marred in any way, because then my salvation would be marred, and it would not be a salvation worth trusting in. But if a perfect sacrifice was offered for me, now I know I've got something that's believable and worth believing in. Now, can I understand that? Absolutely. But can I understand all of it? No. That just baffles me. Why would God love me that much? Yeah, no. I wouldn't love me that much.
Don't you see those pieces, if you've ever been on some, call it a mission trip, and that's a generic term, but when you go places and help people and they ask themselves, why are you here? Why do you care?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a glimpse, is it not?
It is, absolutely. Because that's the extent that they go, I don't get it. Why? You're telling me that God loves me.
Why did you even come?
Exactly
You gave up everything that you had. I mean, and compared to them, we gave up a lot.
Yeah.
And they're asking the same question, why?
Yeah. I just read this past week, it was a story of a missionary, and I don't remember where it was, but it was back in the 50s. And it wasn't the whole Sam Elliott and those guys with the Auca Indians. But this missionary, his name was Sam something, I can't remember his name. At any rate, his story was, he and his fellow missionaries, the men, and the women, their wives, watched. They broke bottles and cut them up. There were like 7 or 8 of them, and they threw them in the river, and all covered with blood, and the alligators ate them. And you would think, what is that about? And here we are trying to reach these people for the cause of Christ, and it looks like senseless killing. The wives, obviously, some of them had kids, they left the country. Long story made short, I forget how many years later, but another guy goes, who, the missionary's name was Sam. He led one guy to Christ. That guy, years and years later, goes back to this tribe. And they said, listen, why should we listen to you? And he said, because your tribe has a saying that you have to listen to the message of one whose blood is in the river. And they go, yeah? He goes, I want to tell you. And he quoted the guy's name and said, his blood is in the river. And he had a message that he wants me to tell you. And half of that tribe came to know Jesus. Now we go, that was senseless, because it just happened years ago, and we don't understand. It's just illogical. And yet God has a sovereign plan. And it was years and years later that this guy ends up going, and they have to listen to his message, because the guy that led him to Jesus spilled his blood in the river. I thought, how cool is that? See, we really don't understand all that God is. We can trust him, because his love for us makes sense. Does that make sense? You with me there?
My friend called it Jesus math.
Yeah, as long as you don't try to use that on, your test in your math class in high school. Because that math teacher might not understand Jesus' math, yeah. Right? I mean, and listen, Jesus' math, how do you get 1 + 1 to equal 1? I don't know, that's the way math works in Jesus, right? But it works. Okay, let's continue. Where am I at here? D. Atheists, they have a problem with absolutes. Now keep in mind, we talked about almost all of these, and even a lot of the other non-atheistic apologetic pathways to knowledge, they have a problem with absolute truth. And such is the case with atheists. Now, underneath D, number 1, they will say God's existence is incompatible with evil. They struggle with that. Because they will say, if you believe in God, then why is there evil in the universe? They say that God and evil are absolutely opposite and are incompatible. Make sense? All right. So here's the thing. Knowing that they will say that leads us to understand that in saying it, they believe in an absolute standard of good and evil. Now, if that's the case, you and I know the standard of good, right? We call him God. They don't. So one of the questions we can ask is, do you believe that there's evil in the world? And you'll get that question down below, but that's one of them. And it's because they say that God can't exist because evil exists. Well, then you can ask them, well, then where did evil come from? And if there is an evil, is there an absolute good? Now they'll say no, but we've got other questions to ask. Yeah, Dave. Okay. All right. Because if there's an absolute standard of evil, and you and I would believe that there's an absolute standard of good, the question is, well then, where did we get that standard? To an atheist, their tongue will swell 8 sizes the size, because they'll go, they don't have an answer for where they get the standard of good or evil. Secondly, they will also say there is no absolute meaning to life. Keep in mind when we talk about absolutes, this is one of those things that they will say, but then you can ask them, do you believe that what you just said is absolutely true? Because it goes back to absolute truth. Because they will not give you the idea that there is an absolute truth, but yet they're making an absolute statement, right? There is no absolute meaning to life. Then you can ask, do you believe that what you just said is absolutely true? And then you go back to, but if that is true then, and there is an absolute meaning of life, then where do we get the meaning of life? Make sense?
Well, like, what would you say, like, what they think the meaning of life is? Because I don't think that they think that there's no meaning at all. They feel like they can find it somewhere else. But...
Yeah, and that's where, Dom, it's easy for them to believe in reincarnation.
Okay.
Because you have to get better in the next life. And then if you do the right things there, then you get better in the next life. So they will have really no meaning of life, but that's why they resort to things like reincarnation. Because, well, that's, to them it makes sense.
Or they're, depending on when they get reincarnated, they say, I have no meaning in life now, but I'm hoping in the next I will.
Yeah, yeah, and hopefully I'll continue to get better.
Explaining in a way.
Yeah, yeah, and because there is no God, see, I can't entertain the whole logic of God and what he did through his son so that I can know. Yeah, that's hard.
And that's not a miracle, right? That you would be one thing in one life and another thing in another life.
Be a miracle I get to the second life.
Yeah. And
it just sometimes, a part of ourselves, we are all prone to this. We sometimes say things And then afterwards, we stand back and look at it going, it's kind of foolish. that I
Yeah,
said that."
really.
My
Really.
children are good at pointing that out. At times, but
It is. I talked to a gal once who was a reincarnationist, and I said, what were you in one of your former lives? She goes, I really don't know, but I think I was a cow in one life and I was a butterfly in another. And I asked, well, how do you know that? Well, I really don't, but I kind of have this affinity for them, so it's probably because I was one of those in my former life. And I said, oh. So I said, can I ask you, in your cycle of lives, where did you begin? I don't know. I said, okay. So in your cycle of lives in the future, where are you going? I don't know. Okay, so wait, I'm just making sure I hear you right. You're saying that it's absolutely okay for you to not know where you've been and where you're going. Well, I'm just asking. And they would have to say yes. And I said, seems to me like if I'm going on a trip, I want to know where I'm going and where I've been. Because wouldn't it seem absolutely sadistic to be stuck in a cycle where you never know? And she goes, I'm not going to answer that.
Well, Doug, so like, as far as like Richard Dawkins and like Sam Harris and like the new atheists and stuff like that, I mean, they've openly said that they don't believe in reincarnation. So like,
Right.
what do you, like, what is their meaning then?
Yeah, and if you ask them, what is the ultimate purpose for life? They don't have one. Now, they'll attach it to maybe good works.
Their word, like their
Absolutely.
settle.
Absolutely. Because even to a reincarnation, so they hope that that's the case. Because in the next life, I want to get better. And I want to get better. Well, what's the ultimate end? Well, they don't really know, but they'll say, well, there has to be this utopia kind of at the end.
Well, not those guys. Not like.
Right. Right. I'm saying a reincarnation would hope that that's the end of it. These guys, they don't know.
That's it. Like, they're done.
yeah. And so this life is all you get. Good luck.
What's the motivation to want to get better in another life or to want to do good things?
There isn't.
Yeah, like.
And that's why we talked underneath 3B. I should just put my glasses on.
Do you want me to read it?
Right? What is the basis of good? Right? Is it based on God's will or not on God's will? That's why we talked about what is the basis of good? They don't have one.
But they want to.
They want to say that there is a good. Well, then how do you know what is good and what is evil?
They're told it.
How do we know? But that's an atheist, right? Because if there's no God, then there can't be an ultimate good. Well, then they have a struggle with evil. Then where did evil come from? You get me? So that's why I throw these things out to you. And now you're kicking it in, and it makes sense. So that if you're talking to an atheist, now you're loaded with some things that you can ask them. Yeah, Dave.
I talked to an atheist one time, and said, if there is a God, why is there evil?
Mm-hmm. That's right. And that's their question to us. Now, we can ask them in return, so would you agree then that there is evil? And what would they say? You have to say yes. Because if they say no, I'm like, listen, what news report did you listen to last night? Right? The first 15 minutes of any newscast.
CNN.
Evil. Yeah, I didn't say that. Evil. All right? Okay. What did I say last? You guys are getting me all
Absolute meaning to life. E2.
We're on E.
Okay, E. Yeah, we got some problems, which, by the way, I call them metaphysical. Metaphysical means the basis, right? The foundation stuff. When we talk about things like being and cause and identity, that's metaphysical. So we're just talking about the basics of life here, okay? And they have problems with that. And the first is the intellect. Atheism says that the mind came from matter. And because they're very naturalist, you remember we talked about there is no God, so nature has to be the highest form. And so they're ultimate naturalists. Which means if we're talking about our minds, and they would agree that we have one, the problem then for them is, well, how can intelligence come from non-intelligence? They don't know how to answer that. Again, to say the Big Bang Theory, and you're going, really? That's what you're coming back with? You're telling me that as an absolute accident, intelligence came? When was the last time, you can ask them, that anything that was intelligent came from non-intelligence? And has that happened since? It doesn't. It's logically contradictory. So, you understand that, right? Good? Okay, the second problem, we talk about the intellect, the second one is actually having thought. It's in the mind again. They will say things like thought, mental events are determined by natural law. Everything is determined by nature. And because everything is all about naturalism, everything is dictated by nature. Even your thought. Now, obviously, we just talked about this, that as well as the intellect, it's self-defeating. We can ask them, so you're thinking right now that natural law is the basis of thought. If they go, well, yeah. We say, well, is your thought intelligent? Again, we just talked about, well then, can intelligence come from non-intelligence? So we're back to the first argument. So the fact that they have thought, ask them, where did you get that thought? Did it come from nature? Well, how can something that is non-intelligent give you intelligence? So do you really believe that you just had an intelligent thought?
Sometimes I tell my patients at work, like they'll be saying all the wonderful things that, you know, technology and medicine has made, all the advances. And so then I'll say, like, you know, they've been trying for years to make a heart with intelligence, and they said that it happened without it.
So which way is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the reasons that we're stating are why I think it's very easy to talk to an atheist. Now, what I think is a great approach with an atheist is turn them into an agnostic. Right? Get them to believe that there could be a God, even though they might say, well, even if there is a God, we can't know him. Now we've made him a strong agnostic. And now you can ask them, well, if there's one thing that we can know about God, and that is that he's unknowable, is it possible that we can know other things? Well, maybe. Good. Now I've made him a weak agnostic, and now I say, would you be willing to look at some of the evidences that prove that there's an existence of God?
You move them through each one of these steps, because some of those steps aren't that far off of where we are.
Exactly right.
So you take them from way out here and give them a title, if that's what it takes for them to get there.
Yep.
And then they'll realize step by step, they're gonna go from there to where you are.
That's right.
It took them a long time to get, more than likely, it took them a long time to get where they are.
Yeah.
Step by step.
Exactly. I mean, think about this, and I'm going to ask a question about Al's comments. How long does it take to believe nonsense? Listen, it can be like that. But then if you believe nonsense, and then you continue to believe nonsense, now you've got a whole experience of nonsensical thought. So if we can just, that's why I say, if you just put a pebble in their shoe, if you can take an atheist and turn them into an agnostic, they're already on their way to being a Christian. Are you with me there? Does that make sense? Okay, so let me give you some questions to ask. And guys, listen, I've already given you a lot of these, and so I'm not picking these in like rational order, but I've got, oh my word, I've got far more than these letters can give you, okay? But here are some. First, can nothing create something? And that goes back to the whole intelligence. Can intelligence come from non-intelligence? Well, can nothing create something? And if they say, yeah, I'm not sure, then the question is, has it ever happened that way? Now, if they give you some kind of Big Bang Theory thing, and they go, well, yeah, nothing created, or nothing existed, and then all these gases got together and bang, now we have everything.
Yeah, but they didn't exist.
That's a great, see, where did the gases come from? And they don't have an answer for that.
What if they care that they don't wanna know, like they don't care? Like they're just like, well, or infinity, or what, you know, or if they feel as if, they're speaking, if, like scientism and stuff, and if they feel as if the universe is, and then they start getting into like, they don't believe in God, but they do believe in like higher beings, meaning like aliens.
Yeah.
So that isn't a God, but they feel it, and then it's just all, and we actually came back, and they don't care to know where the beginning is. They just don't, and then because they don't want to search anymore because this is my life, this is it. Why do I gonna waste my time on that when I'm gonna just die and be in the ground?
Right.
And so like,
That's the question of how long they've been in their nonsense.
Well, and we go back to, right, when we talked about thought and intellect, right? Because what they're saying, is it provable? Well, we talked about evidentialism, right? Now, listen, the reality of what we believe is provable. And it makes sense. Which I'll get to some of these other questions, answer yours. Because what if they don't believe in a supreme being? See, now an atheist then, if they believe, well, there's a higher power, but they're aliens, okay, wait, then you're not an atheist.
well, they don't think it's like a higher power, like it's a power. It's like just another being, I guess equal.
Equal.
Like,
Yeah. So then, would you trust your life to someone who's equal? And would you trust what's coming next, which you don't know? You're going to believe something that is equal to you? And you're fallible, right? You've made mistakes. So you're going to trust in someone else who also makes mistakes, who's not ultimately good? And you're going to trust them? See how that, it falls short, and it begins with, well, yeah, why would you trust someone who's imperfect, who makes mistakes, who's prone to fall short? See?
It all comes down to, people don't like to have a God who tells them what to do. And so if they can get something away from them and just live their own life the way they want to, I think that's where all this comes in, is they don't want God telling them what to do. Just let me plan the thing and I can...
And not just these. Every last pathway to knowledge comes back to, what do I want to believe? Right? And I'm going to fit into something that fits with what I want to believe. Here's the point. We just have to give them a pebble in their shoe to lead them to believe in what is true. That's why on our canoe ride, the first mile marker is truth. We have to get them to truth. Right? Because if it's just about what they believe or what they want to believe, listen, where do you think all these things came from? Other than the pit of hell. Right? Go ahead.
You know, somewhere along I think we have to look back at our own past, because somewhere along this line, we fell into some or all of these categories to some extent. How did the Holy Spirit reach us? You know, and then, you know, those questions that popped into our minds weren't self-made. Those were, you know, we're pinned against the wall, we're checkmated. God checkmated us.
Yeah. And that's what we're going to talk about next Sunday with this whole supernaturalism, which has to be very specific in our supernaturalism. Because some people will believe, well, I believe in the supernatural. Okay, tell me about it. And then they have, well, these aliens came. Okay, wait, that's not the supernatural. We're going to talk about that next week, so hang in there. But let me give you some other questions, because if we're going to talk to an atheist, one question we can ask is, are you certain that God doesn't exist? And their answer will be, they're going to say yes, if they're a true atheist, right? The next question after that is then, can I ask you a question? How do you know that? Leave the burden of proof on them. Because they're going to try to make you prove that God does exist. Make them prove that God doesn't. So ask them, how do you know? And then you can even ask this if you want to go further. Would you say that your five senses brought you to come to make that decision? Now, why would we ask them about their five senses?
Nature, the nature part.
Yes. Okay, because they're gonna say, well, I feel this, I do this, and it's all natural, but we believe in something that is supernatural, which we'll get to again next week. But those are great questions to follow up because it puts them into a tailspin. Here's another question. Does science answer everything? Now keep in mind, because they're naturalists, they will say yes. What is one question that science can't answer?
Where did God come from?
Where did God come from? Exactly. And if you get to things that science is now proving, where did this come from? Science is now beginning to prove what the Scripture has always declared to be true. Guess where all this came from? Now they might just say, well, you believe in intelligent design. Absolutely. And I'm going to tell you who I believe the intelligent one is. Because remember we talked about intelligence can't come from non-intelligence?
That's how they've gotten to that point. That's
Yes.
the step by step.
Exactly right.
They're proving themselves wrong.
That's right. That's right. And
If
so,
they live long enough.
and if they're willing to be honest, right? If they're willing to be honest, that's why you say, does science answer everything? It's a great way to get into the whole intelligence issue. Okay, let me give you some more. Oh, here's one that, again, in the course of conversation, yeah, thank you. Why do you care if people worship God? Atheists will usually be hostile toward you if you say that you believe in God and that you worship God. Well, why would they be hostile? If there's no such thing as a God, let me go. For some reason, they're really antagonistic over that issue, especially worship.
So they're not atheists, then they're anti-theists.
Yes, exactly right. Yep. All right, let me ask you this. Well, I'm just going to rattle off a bunch of questions and then we're done. Here's another one. What is the origin of life? Ask them that, because they're going to make nonsensical answers. They might say the Big Bang, they might say something else. Who knows what they're going to come to? And then ask, does science prove that? And science can't prove that, obviously. Okay? Another one. Where does morality come from? The obvious difference between right and wrong, good and evil. We talked about that earlier, and here's the question you can ask that fleshes that out. Another question, and this is for those that might be atheists but also reincarnationists. You can ask them, why are there no transitional forms in the present? Everything is always past tense and way back. Because we all came from monkeys. Okay, well then why are there no transitional forms in the present? Again, they're going to have an I don't know answer. And then the last question. And this one, again, hopefully you'll earn the right to ask this one because it's a little more confrontational. Do you live according to what you believe or what you lack in belief? And a lot of times that's, if they're honest, they'll say, well, I believe what I lack because I don't have the answers. What's that? Do you live according to what you believe or what you lack in belief? All right, that's the end of the question. I have obviously other questions that I hinted at as we went through, so I didn't give you those. But that gives you enough to head into an atheist argument, okay? And again, just love on them, ask the questions. Now, everything as far as theism goes, I had a feeling we might not get to all of it. So I printed out all of my notes for you. So no excuses, here it is.
Good job.
So even though we didn't have time to go over it, you got it. Here it is. So take it. And then there's even, well, there are no questions at the bottom. One, because theists will give you the idea that God exists and He is intervening in the world. These people are just a step away from trusting in Jesus. So those obvious questions come after this. Okay? Any questions, comments? Yeah, Dustin.
How can atheists be offended by a God that they don't believe in?
Yeah. One, because it challenges their whole thought construct. They feel challenged because you believe something opposite of what they think is true.
That seems to me like they're believing in God, they don't like Him, but they say they don't believe in God.
Yeah. Which is why if we can get an atheist to be a strong agnostic and then turn him into a weak agnostic, and now we've got a chance to give them evidences and proofs for the existence of God. Yeah, good observation.